Hi everybody, it's Ben Thompson here, and welcome to the Import-Export podcast. Today we're talking about the new IMO 2020 regulations. If you're involved in shipping, then you probably already heard of the IMO 2020 regulations that are due to come into effect in the industry on the 1st of January in 2020. Today we're joined by Michael Blake from Scope 3. Michael is a specialist in the field of logistics emissions. And today we're going to discuss how IMO 2020 will affect shipping rates and the industry as a whole. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben. Good to be here.
So before we get started, Michael, can you tell me just a bit about the experience you've had in the shipping industry and how that's led to the work you guys are doing at Scope 3?
Sure. Yeah, look, like many of us, I've been in the shipping game for many years, and about 4 or 5 years ago, we started to look at, sustainability in shipping. There was obviously a movement away from fossil fuel use in a range of other energy sectors and across the community, and we started to think about how that translated to, our backyard being shipping and transport. And largely, we found that there wasn't a lot of sophistication or tools in the market to allow companies to measure the greenhouse gas footprint from transport, sea shipping, air freight, and therefore there still is a real inability to be able to influence and manage those greenhouse gas emissions. So the Scope 3 business was really formed, to help companies get some transparency to this part of the business and understand some of the shifts in the agenda around in transport and shipping that started to focus into sustainability.
Yeah. Well, obviously, then with the IMO 2020, I guess is becoming more of a hot topic and more of an important thing that businesses need to evaluate along their supply chains.
Absolutely, yeah, and of course it is new. So this is one of the challenges is being able to translate what is the changing agenda within the IMO and different industry bodies, and translate that to the shippers who are facing just the day-to-day challenges of moving their products around the place, and just trying to give them some insights into why things are changing. Yeah,
absolutely. So I guess there's plenty going on behind the scenes as we lead up to the 1st of January. So to get started, what can you explain what the IMO 2020 regulations relate to and why they're actually being enforced in the industry?
Sure. So IMO 2020 the target was set back in 2016, and it relates to the sulfur content in fuel. Mm-hmm. So up until 2019, the current allowable tolerance is 3.5% sulfur in fuel. As of the 1st of January 2020, that sulfur content needs to be 0.5%. And sulfur within fuel has been on a downward trajectory over a number of years, but this is probably the most significant shift in recent times, I should say. It's basically around cleaning up the amount of sulfur within the fuel, bringing it more in line. Domestic trucking and landside fuel compliance has had a much lower sulfur tolerance. Mm-hmm. Obviously the sulfur in fuel is what causes acid rain, so it's not a good thing to be breathing in, and that's kind of why I guess we've seen emissions control areas. There's been some early adoption of emissions control areas in other parts of the world that have actually reduced the amount of sulfur around coastal areas for a number of years. So in Europe, they've been in place for a while, and in the US. So this is really just bringing it to a global level that we all need to be moving in the right direction.
Absolutely. So when it comes to the carriers' options in reducing those sulphur oxide emissions, what actual options do they have to do that?
Yeah, look, to put it simply, there's probably two main options. The first one being change the fuel type that they're using. The heavy fuel oil at the minute is quite crude and it's certainly low cost. So the alternative to that is to move to fuels that have been more refined and have less sulfur content.
Yeah.
There's also alternative fuels like LNG, which are more strategic, I guess, deployments by the carriers. There are a large number of vessels already in operation that need to be looking for alternative fuels. So LNG plays a role in the future, and certainly biodiesel and these other products. So fuel is one way to go about it. The other way is to fit what are called scrubbers to the vessels, and I guess there's two main variants to those. There's an open loop and a closed loop scrubber.
Yeah.
Just to drill into that a bit more, the open loop scrubber goes through a process of removing the sulfur from the exhaust fumes, but then has the ability to I guess release that water into the oceans. A closed loop scrubber keeps all that sulfur water, if you like, on board the vessel to be discharged in a sort of a more managed way. I guess the two main differences there, you've got an operational expense if the carriers are going down the change in the fuel type, whereas the scrubbers are more of a capex expenditure, sort of in the realm of, depending on who you ask, up to $5 million to fit or retrofit a scrubber to an existing vessel, possibly less if it's a new vessel. And this is where the carriers are sort of grappling and hedging around where they'll make their investment to be compliant.
And where do you see them actually making the most change? Is the change sort of lending towards changing fuel types or installing scrubbers, or a mix of both, or what's going on in the industry right now to prepare?
Yeah, look, I think largely it's going to be more on the fuel side. I think, to be blunt, the industry has left its run a little late, and the ability or the ability to fit scrubbers is sort of at capacity. So there's only a certain amount of scrubbers that were able to be fit within the time frame. Yeah. I'm not exactly sure on what that number is, but that is sort of at capacity. Yeah. Anything outside who hasn't already, the carriers that haven't already locked in getting scrubbers in place some time ago will be in the market buying fuel. So it's largely going to be a fuel play, but certainly there are scrubbers in the market.
Okay, yeah. Cool. So we've got the shipping lines that have to make these changes to meet the regulations, which is to reduce emissions. But I guess people are going to be wondering, like, how is this actually going to affect the shipping rates? Shipping rates tend to go up and down over the years, and there seem to be a lot of different surcharges involved in the industry already. But how is the fuel prices or the actual sea freight rates going to be affected by these changes?
That's the $1 million question. I think that the logistics industry and forwarding and shipping, there has been a few questions around certain surcharges in the past, and I think that makes it a challenge for both the shippers and the logistics industry, to deliver these costs and increases. But what we're seeing is that there will be an increase in cost, the quantum of which I think a lot of people aren't really clear on yet, including the shipping lines. The whole, on the fuel side, the supply and demand, also the supply of the low sulfur fuel still has a fair way to play out, and how that's going to impact pricing. So I think the first 12 months we'll be learning a lot. And I think the key that the way that we're seeing is that the carriers are approaching is trying to give shippers transparency to, I guess, fluctuations or movement in the bunker price by extracting out, if they're all-in rates that you're typically buying from a forwarder or a shipping line, is now removing that bunker element to be sitting outside your rate profile and more floating, which obviously gives the shipper transparency to particular movements in the bunker, because their price will be going up or down. I guess for us, the key is that is to, we sort of see it from both sides, is that, obviously there'll be increased costs. These costs are real for the shipping line. So I think that's an important thing to understand, is that it's not a dodgy surcharge that's just being levied on the shippers. As always, shippers need to be keep themselves informed to make sure that they're in line with changing market conditions. So making sure that, as bunker prices are coming off, that their bunker prices are going down. So there's an element to that. But obviously the key here is that the charge is real. Understanding the market, changing market conditions as best they can by staying close to their shipping line providers. But then also to ultimately understand that the reason for the increase in costs is to clean up the shipping industry, to bring it in line with sort of other transport modes that, sulphur in the environment is ultimately not a good thing. So it's a good cause at the end of the day.
So I guess, shippers, they have to be aware that the bunker price could fluctuate a lot more than it has done in the past. What are some good tips or resources that shippers can be monitoring to understand in advance, if possible, how the rates are going to go up or down, and by how much? Like how can they keep an eye on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I wish we had a silver bullet to that at the minute. But I think the key is to stay connected to the industry and stay connected to your shipping line and logistics providers. Yeah. I think shipping lines have the best line of sight to what's happening in the fuel markets without sort of heading off and becoming a fuel expert in fuel markets. Mm-hmm. Keeping close to your shipping line partners and understanding what they're seeing in the trends is really important. Yeah. And trying to have a really open dialogue about that to say, for them to understand that for pricing purposes, transparency and I guess a good line of sight to where the trends are heading is really important to ensure that we don't, start to induce freight risk in terms of our pricing. For import or export product is really important. So, I guess to answer your question, it's really important to keep in close contact with the carriers, keep in contact with the industry bodies that you're involved with to see where the trends are heading.
Yeah. I hope they can provide really open communications and good resources, because, like you said, it's about communicating that information all the way down the supply chain, whether it be from the shipping line, through a forwarder, or whoever they're dealing with. If they're not communicating these changes and price rises, I think it's going to cause, some pretty upset people. But if it's communicated in the right way, maybe it, be a bit more, people be a bit more understanding.
Correct. Yeah. As I said before, I think that there will be a sharp learning curve, and I think everyone needs to be as prepared as they can for the first quarter next year. Like anything, we expect that it will settle down over time, but I think people need to be really tuned to it in the initial first 12 months, that's for sure.
And I guess that these increased costs are essentially going to be, passed on to the end consumer. Businesses can only absorb so much cost. Maybe, do you think that they will be absorbing these costs, or do you think that the costs will, nearly all of that will be passed on to the consumers, and will the consumers be understanding about that?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I mean, if we go back to the point that it's the idea is right, that shipping needs to sort of play its role in cleaning itself up around this, obviously the sulfur issue, but then ultimately greenhouse gas and moving out to 2050, some of this carbon reduction strategies that will start to be deployed. So I think it's certainly for ours, it's a cost that is relevant to be passed on to consumers. I mean, we're seeing buying or consumer patterns, sort of leaning towards consumers being willing to pay that, a little bit more if they know that it comes from a sustainable sort of supply chain. So I think certainly passing on costs to clean up transport, we shouldn't be too adverse to, but I guess that's not always straightforward. And our ability to articulate to the consumer these sort of very industry specific changes is probably quite difficult. So I think it's a challenge, but ultimately this agenda around the shift in focus within the IMO around sustainability is not, this is not going to be an isolated, I guess, change. The IMO 2020, we'll expect that there will be more discussions around these sorts of initiatives in years to come. So I think it's important that shippers understand that this is a changing landscape and be open to learning about it and obviously seeing how that fits in with their business, their brand and these sorts of things.
So I guess it comes to how they communicate and market that to their clients and their consumers too, to get that message across. So it's it's not just an increase in price, it's sort of communicated as to why that's actually happening. Correct,
exactly.
Yeah, okay. So when it comes to the shipping invoices, so if it's going to be a fluctuation in the bunker charges, is that the only thing that shippers need to keep an eye on when it comes to invoices? Like, will it be reworded, or what will that look like? If you know.
Yeah, I think the challenge is that each of the shipping lines will have their own approach to it. Whilst the fundamentals might be similar, the terminology around how they're going to tag the specific surcharges might be all different.
Okay.
The acronyms will be different.
Yeah.
So that is a challenge. More acronyms, exactly. That's what we need in global trade. So that will be a challenge for shippers to actually differentiate across their 6 different carriers.
Yeah.
Which charge relates, which charge relates to the bunker. But I think quickly they'll, should be able to figure that out. But what we're seeing probably is a shift towards an isolated line item. So we should be able to see our whether it be a low sulfur surcharge. There's probably 2 ways that it can be applied on an invoice. It'll either be a low sulfur surcharge, which is a specific, low sulfur cost. Or it will be more of a floating bunker element, which is obviously a direct link to the full fuel price, which is being required to meet the IMO compliance. So they will be the 2 things of how they're going to land on anyone's desk. And depending on how the rates are structured with the shippers at the minute, if it's northbound commodity trade, they're typically all in rolled up rates. So that will be potentially a shift away from those historically rolled in rates to base plus bunker, which is sort of going back in time a bit. But so we could see some changes in the way that happens in the market. Shippers just need to probably be aware of these potential things coming and but I guess work to identify across the different carriers how the different costs are being applied.
Yeah. And just lastly, carriers will obviously be looking to become as efficient as possible because fuel is now more volatile. Do you think that the practice of slow steaming will become widespread? Do you think transit times sort of could be increased a little because of this?
I think the slow steaming element has a fair bit to play out. I don't see that happening immediately.
Yeah.
I think in some of the recent information we've seen out of the IMO is that it might play a role, but I think there are implications to, particularly in an area like Australia, around what that actually means. I guess if you start to slow steam to then keep the same levels of service, do you have to introduce additional vessels which completely offset the intention around the slow steaming in the first place? So I think there's a fair bit to play out that yet. I mean, vessels have been, working on optimizing speeds around fuel use anyway. So look, I think that I don't see that happening in the short term because of some of those complexities, but certainly something that we'll have to keep an eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that's great. Well, I think you've given a great overview on, what it is and what's happening. I guess only time will tell exactly how the industry, manages that. I think, as you said, I think the key is that, he's communicating these extra charges. They're coming and they're going to be volatile. And if they're not explained properly to people along the supply chain, it's not going to be taken up very well. So I think hopefully we see, some really good communications around that to try and, keep people happy.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Michael. I really appreciate your time. Giving great insight and, yeah, we'll chat to you soon.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye.